Senator Paterson.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. And I rise to make a contribution on the Public Government's Performance and Accountability Amendment, Waiver of Debt and Act of Grace Payments Bill 2019. In doing so, I listened very carefully to the contributions made by Senator Siewert, substantially about robo-debt, Senator O'Neill substantially about the Foreign Investment Review Board and also about robo-debt. I will be making some concrete observations about the bill itself later in my speech, but like Senator Siewert and like Senator O'Neill, I'd like to make some closely related observations about transparency in general, the principle of transparency and the importance of transparency in government, the importance of transparency in public life, the importance of transparency for political parties. Because in a way it's very apposite that Labor senators, Senator Gallagher in particular, has moved a private member's bill this morning that goes to the issue of transparency, because it is an issue which has been very prominent in the media in the last 24 hours. And I know that transparency is something that's important to all senators, Labor senators included. And in fact, they have a great opportunity today to contribute to the transparency that we know is so important in our public life. And I encourage them to make that contribution here in the chamber or through the media or by whichever means that they feel is most appropriate. I'm referring, of course, to the matters in the media this morning and last night on the 60 Minutes program and The Age regarding Mr Somyurek, the now former member of Mr Andrews' cabinet in the Labor government in Victoria. In the interests of transparency, there are some fairly important issues to be answered about this affair and the extent to which it involves the federal Labor Party here in Canberra. Now, I'm sure, of course, that federal Labor MPs will be going out today, given their lines by the Leader of Opposition's office, to say that this is a state matter, that this is a matter for Mr Andrews, that this is not a matter involving the federal Labor Party. But in fact, that's not the case, and we know that's not the case for a number of reasons. Mr Albanese said in one of his interviews this morning in the morning media that he barely knows Mr Somyurek. He might have met him a couple of times. Most people outside of Victoria wouldn't have even heard of him. I thought that was a little bit strange, given that Mr Somyurek is a member of the National Executive of the Labor Party, attends national executive meetings with Mr Albanese, presumably sits alongside him in some of those meetings and engages in matters of state as it concerns the Australian Labor Party and its national governance. As I understand it, in fact, he's a significant figure on that national executive, quite an influential figure on that national executive. So it would surprise me if Mr Albanese doesn't know Mr Somyurek and doesn't know him, in fact, very well. We heard in the recordings last night, televised by 60 Minutes, both audio recordings from telephone phone calls and, in fact, sensationally video evidence, which I'll come to in a minute, that Mr Somyurek claims to effectively own, control and have great influence over a number of members of Mr Albanese's caucus. He claimed to have called in the member for McEwen, Rob Mitchell, to inform him that his career was coming to an end. It's an interesting power for a state politician to have who's got no connection to the federal Labor Party, but he called Mr Mitchell in and said that presumably his performance was not up to standard by Mr Somyurek's estimation and that his career would be coming to an end. He boasted of how the member for Bruce, Mr Hill, his career would also be coming to an end and he would be sacking him from the federal parliament in the same way he's sacked a number of local government authorities in Victoria. He even claimed and quite amusingly reenacted his engagements with the member for Gellibrand, Mr Watts, who apparently bows to Mr Somyurek in genuflex, as my colleague Senator Scarr has interjected, genuflex towards Mr Somyurek in respect of his authority and control over the federal parliamentary Labor Party. He made similar claims about the influence he exercises over the member for McNamara, Mr Burns, and of course the member for Holt, Mr Byrne. I note that among these claims of influence and control, which might just be boasting, it might just be big claims made by Mr Somyurek, or indeed there might be some truth to it. And I think it is incumbent on all Labor MPs named, and those not named, including the Leader of the Opposition, to front up today in the interest of transparency and explain exactly what their connections are to Mr Somyurek, exactly what their involvement is with Mr Somyurek, exactly what knowledge they had of Mr Somyurek's activities. Are we seriously to believe that last night was the first time that Mr Albanese had a whiff that maybe something was not completely kosher about Mr Somyurek, that maybe something was amiss, that maybe he was engaged in multiple recruitment or even branch stacking in the Labor Party? His activities in the Victorian Labor Party are notoriously well known. No one involved in politics, on any side of politics, would be unfamiliar with Mr Somyurek's reputation, and it beggars belief that Mr Albanese, who was happy to sit on the National Executive with him yesterday, suddenly has a problem today and suddenly is going to act on it today. Of course, on the involvement of federal Labor parliamentarians with Mr Somyurek, and in the interest of transparency, it appeared from the footage last night that at least some of it was filmed inside the office of a federal member of parliament. You could clearly see from the footage an Australian Parliament House login displayed on one of the computer screens. I don't think they have those in state parliamentary offices. I could be wrong, but I think they're only in federal parliamentary offices. Also in that footage was some maps, electoral maps, and particularly one that came up time and time again was a map of the electorate of Holt. I don't know why a state member of parliament would have that in their office. Perhaps it was indeed in a federal parliament office. And in fact, later in the program, you could even see a close-up shot when Mr Somyurek is pacing up and down on the phone of some call flutes that appear to have Mr Burns' name on it, but appear to be in some way connected to him. So it clearly, in the interest of transparency, it's up to Mr Byrne, Mr Albanese and the other Labor MPs named in last night's episode and in the papers today to come forward and explain what they knew about Adam Somyurek's activities and when they knew about them. It is not sufficient for them to say this is a state matter. It is not sufficient for them to say this is a matter for Mr Andrews. If they don't do that, then I think Mr Albanese has failed a very important test of leadership. Mr Albanese made a big song and dance about how he was expelling John Setka from the Labor Party. That didn't quite go to plan, and finally Mr Setka left the Labor Party, although certainly not by Mr Albanese's hand. And this is yet another test for him and his leadership. Is he actually going to ensure that Mr Somyurek is out of the Labor Party? He has been sacked from Mr Andrews' cabinet, but he remains a member of Parliament, he remains a member of the Labor Party, and whenever he does so, that reflects very poorly on Mr Albanese and his leadership. And the key question in the interest of transparency that I think all Australians would like to have answered is who runs the Labor Party? Is it the faceless factional men like Mr Somyurek who boast that he will be choosing who replaces Mr Andrews when he retires as Premier? And is it him who says that Mr Albanese cannot be protected, that he in fact runs the Labor Party? Or does Mr Albanese run the Labor Party? Does a federal parliamentary leader of the Labor Party run the Labor Party? That is the key test today. And the fact that Labor MPs have been willing to tolerate this behaviour for so long in such an open and acknowledged way up until today reveals a lot about them and their commitment to transparency. So many speeches will be given in the Senate this morning about transparency. Any speech which doesn't deal with this core issue on the front of everyone's mind today on the matter of transparency, I think reflects on the contributions of those that are making them. Turning now to the bill. As I understand it, the purpose of the opposition, and thank you for the interjection, Senator McCarthy. You weren't in the chamber previously when your colleagues were making contributions to this debate. Senator O'Neill gave a very long speech in which I'm not sure she even referred to the bill on any occasion, certainly not any provisions of the bill or any detail of the bill. I think others were the same. Anyway, I'll turn to the bill now, and I promise in the 6 minutes and 53 seconds I have remaining, I'll talk more about the bill than any Labor senator has so far in this debate. Maybe others will rise to the challenge as they come to speak next. But as I understand it, the purpose of the opposition's bill is to amend the Public Governance Performance and Accountability Act 2013, otherwise known as the PGPA Act, to increase transparency in government operations relating specifically to acts of grace payments and waivers of debts. I'm advised that it would require the Department of Finance to include in its annual report details of decisions made under that Act to authorise act of grace payments or to waive debts owed to the Commonwealth. I note that in recognition of the privacy and confidentiality concerns, the bill only seeks that the total number of matters authorised and the total value of those authorisations be disclosed. The Act of Grace and Waiver of Debt powers exist under the PGPA Act to enable the consideration of and resolution of matters that fall outside the usual legislative frameworks. They are intended to be exercised only as a last resort, but they are important powers as they provide the flexibility for the Commonwealth to deal quickly and effectively with issues where special circumstances arise. The government does not use these powers lightly, but they are a necessary capability to respond to fast-moving events where existing legislation may not be able to be used. For example, these powers were an important part of the government's response to COVID-19, enabling the waiver of annual levies in the fishing industry and the waiver of Commonwealth Register of Institutions and Courses for Overseas Students levy for the education sector to help support these sectors in this challenging time. In considering this bill, it's important to note that there is already a robust system in place for the exercise of these powers. The Department of Finance consults broadly and confidentially with the applicants and the impacted Commonwealth agencies to ensure that decision-makers have all the relevant information in considering each claim. Further, the consideration of the exercise of these powers for amounts over $500,000 can only occur after an advisory committee compromising relevant public officials with knowledge of both the process and also the policy issue has been established and has provided advice to the Minister for Finance or to the Assistant Minister for Finance. There is, of course, merit in disclosure of some data where individual payments will not be identifiable. Indeed, the Minister for Finance has reported some aggregate data in his answers to questions on notice, and of course the Senate estimates process provides a very important oversight to powers exercised like these by ministers, and it's a very welcome part of this Senate. And I note the 50th anniversary of such oversight committees was recently. Now, most recently, the debt waiver data was provided in response to a question from Senator McAllister during the October 2019 Senate estimates, and no doubt in our upcoming Senate estimates in October later this year, senators will have further questions about how this power was exercised, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is an appropriate question to ask. They could also explore this issue to the Senate Select Committee on COVID-19, of which I serve as Deputy Chair, which is conducting an ongoing oversight of all decisions of government and advice to government in this period. Many of these payments are to individuals or small businesses and small organisations, and sometimes the value of that payment can in fact pertain to sensitive issues such as the value of lost income. However, amending the PGPA Act as proposed by this bill to mandate disclosure in Finance's annual reports is an unnecessary and inflexible expansion of the PGPA Act in the view of the government. The normal approach is for annual report requirements to consist of fixed requirements that do not change from year to year. That model for reporting would be too rigid for discretionary payment data, where some years can yield few discretionary payments and a risk therefore could arise that the value of an individual payment could be deduced. There's also an issue here of appropriate consultation. Ordinarily, the annual reporting requirements are not changed without consultation with the Joint Committee on Public Accounts and Audit. If the JCPAA had been consulted, they might have suggested that the intent of this bill could be better addressed through an amendment to the PJPA annual reporting rule or through direction from the Finance Minister to his department, taking into account the risks of disclosure and amending the presentation of the data in a sensitive way to reduce that risk. Requests for active grace payments or waiver of debts are made on the basis of utmost privacy and confidentiality, as is appropriate. This bill, though, could create a risk that, in those years where there are a small number of matters authorised, as I said earlier, rigid reporting as envisaged by the bill could serve to identify a particular claimant and therefore breach their privacy. There are no safeguards in the proposed bill to protect against this possibility. Rather than the approach that's proposed in this bill, it is preferable that the government releases data in a way that ensures there's no inadvertent disclosures that may compromise the Commonwealth's commitment to treat claims in confidence. I'm advised that the Minister for Finance has directed his department to commence disclosure of annual and 5-year aggregate data in relation to active grace payments and debt waivers, including in the 2019-20 financial year. There are sufficient payments, I'm advised, in the 2019-20 year that there is not a concern about privacy this year, and I understand this data will be made public later in this calendar year on the Finance website and on the transparency.gov.au website, and no doubt that will be able to be pursued in the appropriate way through Senate estimates and other means. In conclusion, the government believes that this bill is unnecessary and an inflexible expansion of the PGPA Act, and it's not been considered by the JCPAA. The government, of course, strongly believes in transparency in government operations, and that's why the Finance Minister has made that direction to his department to release the information that the proposed bill is seeking and will be publicised later this year through appropriate public mechanisms. In closing, though, I just want to return to the point that I made in the opening. It's all very well and good for Labor senators and others to come into this chamber and extol the virtues of transparency, but we should take them at their word when they seek to choose to exercise that transparency about their own activities, about their own affairs, about their own misdeeds, which we've seen so prominently displayed in the media.